Good afternoon. I'm Ron Silver. I really always love coming down to Mary's Woods and doing some history talks. Today, we're actually kind of a few days early for celebrating the life of Dr. King. What I want to tell you is this is really kind of a preview because I'll be back here on Monday at 2 o'clock when we will have our annual celebration of the life of Dr. King. And it was at one of those celebrations in 2016 that Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian was our guest speaker. And this year has just been not this year, but the year of 2020 was just an awful year for losing giants from the civil rights movement. And one of the giants we lost was Dr. Vivian. And that would have been a much larger thing nationally, except for the fact within about 18 hours of the death of Dr. Vivian, one of his closest friends passed away, Congressman John Lewis, who was, a figure far better known nationally because of all of his years in Congress. And so when we thought about what I might talk about in the month of January, because I've been doing these talks every month, I thought, let's look at the life of Dr. Vivian, because he really kind of got lost in the commemoration of Congressman Lewis. And as I was preparing this talk, I came to a realization. The part of Dr. Vivian's life that brought him into the public sphere really is in a remarkably short period of time, from 1960 until 1965. And we're going to spend most of my time when I talk about Dr. Vivian focused on those 5 years during the height of the civil rights movement. But the man lived an incredibly vital and important life from 1965 until he passed away this last summer, shortly before his birthday, his 96th birthday. And as I reflected on that, I thought, there's a whole generation, the civil rights activist generation, that's worth looking at because of what happened, not only their actions during the civil rights movement, but how they lived their lives afterwards. There are some people we should look at. And so this talk today, the first half is going to be a celebration of really the extraordinary life of Dr. Vivian. I get to tell some stories because I really adored the man. I got to spend about 4 days with him when he was here in 2016. We'll spend the first half talking about Dr. Vivian. And then the second half, we're going to look at two people who were very important during the movement, and a woman who was really just a foot soldier of the movement, but how they've lived their lives since. And so with that, we're going to get started. And I love this photograph because having spent 4 days with Dr. Vivian, I can tell you that this smile on his face was the quintessential man that I got to know. And this is when he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama, I think in the year 2013. And if you're interested in who might that woman be behind him, it's actually Loretta Lynn, the country western superstar who received her award the same year as Dr. Vivian. Dr. Vivian was born in Missouri, but fairly soon he moved with his mother and grandparents to Peoria, Illinois. When I was growing up, the question was, how does it play in Peoria? Well, Dr. Vivian could tell you because he grew up there. And there were some important parts about his growing up. This was in Illinois, a northern state. But in the 1940s, America we were still very much in the era of Jim Crow. And I'm going to mention something because this may or may not play into how we look at the events I'm going to talk about. But what you have to think about in terms of American history is after the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, where we actually tried for about 10 years to live with the concept of giving African Americans rights. that didn't work out so well for many white people, and they decided to go through a period of what in the South was called redemption. What that meant was it was redeeming the South for white Americans. And what they instituted was Jim Crow, which was a strict rule of segregation, of racial hierarchy, with whites on top and blacks on the bottom. And it was all driven by laws in the South, but very much in the North, here in Oregon as well. It was driven by culture, by history. And so even though Illinois, Peoria, was a northern city, when C.T. was a young teenager, he starts going to Western Illinois University. The place he liked to hang out, the local restaurant, was segregated. Their lunch counter was segregated. And in 1947, it's kind of remarkable to think that far, but in 1947, Dr. Vivian organized a sit-in to desegregate that lunch counter in Peoria, Illinois, and it was successful. And he went on to graduate from Peoria and to live his life, but he had a calling for the church. And as an older person in his 30s, he decides to go to American Baptist Theological Seminary, which was an African American Baptist school in Nashville, Tennessee. And this is just one of these remarkable times in American history where sort of just everybody, fortunately, was in the same place at the same time to make history. And so among the people that, and what you have to think about in terms of Nashville is, of course, Vanderbilt University is probably the most famous college in Nashville. But there were several historically black colleges there. There was Tennessee State, there was Fisk University, there was the medical school, Meharry Medical School, and there was American Baptist Theological Seminary. And so what you had gathering in Nashville in the late 50s was this remarkable group of Americans. And you see some of them here on your screen. You see John Lewis, he was at American Baptist. Diane Nash was at Fisk. Bernard Lafayette was at American Baptist, rooming with John Lewis. Jim Bevel, who the man in the small circle, and who you hear a little more about later. You'll see Dr. Vivian. And the man in the right corner is Reverend James Lawson, who is still alive. I think he's in his mid-90s now. And Reverend Lawson was a devotee of Mahatma Gandhi and a believer in nonviolence, but a believer in nonviolent direct confrontation against power. And what these students, under the direction of Lawson, start to organize is they start to organize an attempt to desegregate Nashville, a very southern state, but not the heart of the South. It's not Alabama, it's not Mississippi, it's not South Carolina or Georgia. So it was very much in the Confederacy during the war, but they had already actually integrated their schools. They actually complied with Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s, starting with Clinton High School. And so Lawson, with these young men and the wisdom of an older student, I don't know if any of you, when you went to college, there was like somebody back from the war. When I went to USC, we had guys coming back from Vietnam who just were a heck of a lot smarter than I was, for dang sure. And that's what C.T. Vivian was. He was this older undergraduate in the theological seminary, even though he already had his bachelor's degree. And so with Lawson as the person really giving the lessons, and with C.T. as sort of a mentor amongst equals, these students formed this amazing army to apply these nonviolent principles. And this is when the Nashville sit-in movement begins. It's following on the famous sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina, of the 4 students there, and they take it to Nashville. And you see here's John Lewis getting thrown out of his chair, and C.T. and Bernard Lafayette and these others all participated in these lunch counter sit-ins. And they were trained, they would go through rigorous training of being abused and learning how to protect themselves. And they used this moral force of nonviolence as a way to draw attention to what they were doing. And a couple of remarkable photographs. This campaign had been going on for weeks. And finally, the students decided to confront the mayor of Nashville, Mayor West. And the photograph that is on the screen is on the left is of the students marching to City Hall in Nashville to directly confront Mayor West with a moral question. And you see the people leading this march are C.T. Vivian, Diane Nash, and Bernard Lafayette. And the next photograph shows them on the steps of City Hall. And you see Dr. Vivian with the white shirt and the tie. And on his right shoulder, or on his left shoulder is Diane Nash. And on his right shoulder is Mayor West. And Diane Nash looks at the mayor and she says to him, Mayor West, is it morally acceptable to take someone's money when they come into your store, but you won't let them sit at a lunch counter? And approaching the mayor from what these folks would call Christian witnessing. They had been, witnessing when they'd been those lunch counters, and they were witnessing in front of him. And Mayor West says, young lady, you're right, it is not morally acceptable. And that's the moment where, having used nonviolent tactics, the young students of Nashville are able to bring about the desegregation of downtown Nashville. Well, the next part of our story is about the Freedom Riders. And this is the 60th anniversary this year of the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Rides begin as a concept with a group called the Congress of Racial Equality, which is based in New York. And next Monday, when we do the memoriam, one of the people that we lost last year was now an old man in his 80s named Bruce Boynton. In 1958, Bruce Boynton was a young Howard Law student who wanted to go home to see his parents down in Selma, Alabama, and he got on a bus. And he ends up getting arrested when he's ordering a sandwich in Virginia. And Thurgood Marshall takes that case to the Supreme Court saying, look, if you get on a bus, and when I talk about this with students, this is how I say to it. I say, okay, kids, when you ever go on an airplane, what's the first thing you do when you get off the plane? And I say, who goes to the bathroom? And all the kids raise their hand. And I said, before you get on the plane, who goes to the Starbucks at PDX and gets a coffee? And I hate to say it for a bunch of 14-year-olds, but they all raise their hand. It's the times we live in. And I said, exactly, because that's all part of your traveling experience. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court decided in the case of Boynton versus Virginia. If you're on a Greyhound bus going on a long journey, when the bus pulls into the station, going to the bathroom is part of that journey. And going to the lunch counter is part of that journey. And buying the ticket at the ticket counter for sure is part of your journey. And all of those parts of the journey, once you got south of the District of Columbia, was strictly segregated. And so when the Supreme Court said, no, that's all part of the interstate commerce experience, and the Interstate Commerce Act that Congress passed said you can't base any of that on race, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, decided, let's put the South to the test. And so the Freedom Riders, there were 13 of them, they set out from Washington, D.C., and they headed south, 6 of them in a Greyhound bus, 7 of them in a Trailways bus. And the journey was actually fairly unremarkable until they got to Alabama. And on the left, you see what the Ku Klux Klan did to the Greyhound bus. Outside of the town of Anniston, they ambushed the bus, tried to kill everybody on it. Fortunately, there was a plainclothes detective for the Alabama State Police on board the bus who was armed and decided that was not the day he wanted to die. And so Detective Cowlings, along with others, managed to keep everybody alive. But the Trailways bus beat it through Anniston without stopping, so they didn't get attacked. But when they got to the bus station in Birmingham, they were set on by the Ku Klux Klan, which had permission from the head of the police department in Birmingham, Bull Connor. Bull Connor had given them 10 minutes to do whatever they wanted to the Freedom Riders, and then they'd have to clear out. And so you'll see what happens when the Freedom Riders come into the Trailway station. And it looked then, as the rides were going to go, if you talk to folks from CORE, they will tell you they were going to get their people medical attention and then start up again. But there was certainly a point where the rides had stopped. And these young folks in Tennessee decided, no, we're going to keep going. We're going to bring this thing back to life. And that was the Diane Nashes and the Jim Bevels and the Bernard Lafayettes and the John Lewises. And they get the bus rides again down to Montgomery, where they're beaten to a pulp. And finally, the Department of Justice intervenes, and a federal judge in Alabama issues an injunction against the Klan and against the governor from beating up on these people. And so the decision is made, let's keep going with these rides. Let's get these folks to New Orleans. Let's do this. Well, in between Montgomery and New Orleans is a state called Mississippi. And the governor of Mississippi said, no way are you going to come in and break our laws. You're all going to get arrested. And the Department of Justice made a deal with Senator Jim Eastland, who was the head of, he was the most powerful man, far more powerful than the governor in the state of Mississippi. And Senator Eastland and Bobby Kennedy made a deal. Bobby Kennedy said, okay, I'm going to take this on through the courts, through the Interstate Commerce Commission, but we won't do any, you can violate the constitutional rights of all of these Freedom Riders, and we're not going to get in the way of that. You just got to promise not to kill them. And Eastland makes a commitment, no, they're not going to get physically harmed. So the Freedom Rides continue. And by the way, the Freedom Riders don't know about that deal, which you'll hear later on in the story. But in that first bus leaving Montgomery, hopefully going to New Orleans, but in fact never gets past Jackson, Mississippi, on that first bus is C.T. Vivian. And that bus is protected by the Alabama National Guard all the way to the Mississippi border. And then at the Mississippi border, the Mississippi National Guard takes over protecting the bus. But that bus, other than changing the guard, that bus ain't stopping for nobody. And I put the caption here is why my mom would have loved CT. And she would have. But in this particular moment, this tense confrontation that you're seeing on the bus is between C.T. Vivian and the head of the Mississippi National Guard, saying, you got to pull this bus over so people on this bus can go to the bathroom. Because when my mom and dad and my brother and I took road trips, if my mom said I got to go, it was the next gas station. Otherwise, it would have been Divorce City. And so my mom would have loved CT because he was fighting for the right of those folks to go to the bathroom on that bus. But unfortunately, the Mississippi National Guard did not have the same common sense as my father, and so everybody on that bus suffered. But they got to Jackson, and what you can't tell from this photograph, but in fact, what you see there is you see John Lewis, you see James Farmer, who was the head of Corps, who'd come up with the whole idea, and C.T. Vivian, and you'll notice my caption says the bus shrinks, because that's actually a paddy wagon in Jackson, Mississippi. They're all on their way to jail for breaking the law by wanting to use a white bathroom in Jackson, Mississippi. So, no what? No. This is E.T. Vivian's mugshot. And I'll tell you why I'm going to read it again. No. No what? No. The correct answer is no, sir. Initially, and certainly the correct answer to no what. C.T. Vivian wasn't going to say no, sir. He was just going to say no. And for that, he was beaten heavily in the Hinds County Jail. Now, that was a problem because Senator Eastland had said these folks weren't going to get beaten up. So they had to hush that one up. But that also gives you, but CT knew what was coming. Dr. Vivian knew what was coming. And he still just said no, because he was going to retain his dignity. Well, what happens, and you see where I say on to Birmingham, and you see the very famous photograph from now where the Freedom Rides were May through the summer of 1961. And just to finish that part of the story, what happened was over the course of that summer, over 300 folks got arrested in Jackson, Mississippi for a breach of the peace because they had the temerity to either try to use the wrong bathroom or go to the wrong lunch counter. But in September of 1961, the Department of Justice's lawsuit in front of the Interstate Commerce Commission was successful, and companies like Greyhound and Trailways were ordered to integrate all of these facilities or lose their license to operate in interstate commerce. And it's amazing how companies will comply with an order like that. But what also happened was Dr. Vivian, who was he was a minister, he comes to the attention of Martin Luther King, and he becomes part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference team, if you will. Southern Christian Leadership Conference was started in the late 1950s after the Montgomery bus boycott by Dr. King and other black ministers in the South to sort of have an organization that could engage in civil rights matters, not in the courts. The courts was the purview of the NAACP. But the Southern Christian Leadership Conference wanted to have a mechanism to go into cities and do what was known as direct action. And so Reverend Vivian becomes part of that team. And in the spring of 1963, Dr. King brings his organization into Birmingham, and that's when you hear the stories of the Children's Crusade. You see the photographs of Bull Connor, the same man who had given the Klan 10 minutes grace to beat up on the Freedom Riders. This is when Bull Connor brings out his dogs, brings out his fire hoses, puts over 2,500 or so young children in jail. The Department of Justice, again, the Civil Rights Division, comes into Birmingham and brokers a deal, brokers a peace. And that action by Dr. King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then a month later, similar action by Medgar Evers and the NAACP in Mississippi really pushes President Kennedy to seek a national solution. And he goes on national television, and if you've never seen it, I really encourage you to see the speech that John Kennedy gives when he introduces his civil rights legislation that is going to become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. But that all comes out of Birmingham and Jackson. And so now Dr. Vivian is part of the team with Dr. King. Now, hang on a second. I had mentioned Jim Bevel earlier. He was one of those students in Nashville. He ends up marrying Diane Nash. And Jim Bevel is, he's a difficult person to talk about in terms of the movement because he was kind of an organizational genius. He had some brilliant ideas. He's most famous for convincing Dr. King to let the children march in Birmingham, which really made the difference there. And he was the one who came up with the idea of the Selma to Montgomery March. That was his idea after the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. That happens in 1965. But to say that Jim Bevel was a slightly unstable character is kind of an understatement. And if you look at this photograph here, this was the brain trust of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1963. You see Dr. King on the left, Reverend Joseph Lowry, who sadly we also lost in 2020, and Reverend Dr. Y.T. Walker on the right. We lost Dr. Walker, I think, about 2 years ago. Well, Dr. Walker was the field general in Birmingham. He was number 2 to King, and Birmingham was really Walker's baby. He ran that show. And he also really saw how unstable Jim Bevel was becoming. And it was kind of like, this town ain't big enough for the both of us. And Dr. King was not willing to give up on Jim Bevel. And so Dr. Walker leaves from that field general role within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He did not want to maintain that role. And that Dr. King needed somebody to take that slot. And the person he comes up with is Dr. Vivian. Now, it's now the summer of 1964 that civil rights legislation that John Kennedy introduces to Congress the night of what turns out to be Medgar Evers' murder, it's languishing in the Senate, which has a strong Southern filibustering base. And he's not really getting it anywhere near the finish line. And then, of course, on November 22nd, 1963, John Kennedy is killed in Dallas. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who was known as the master of the Senate and probably the most effective Senate Majority Leader until Mitch McConnell of our lifetime, he becomes president. And Lyndon Johnson was the master of the Senate. And he starts moving it closer to the finish line. And but it's not there yet. And so in June of 1964, Dr. King is trying to come up with new ways to pressure this bill that would desegregate all these public places. And one of the things they decide to do is have a wade-in at an all-white beach in St. Augustine, Florida. And next Monday, when you're going to get to hear Dr. Vivian's talk that he gave here, he's going to go in at length about this moment in his life where he thought, of all things, he was going to end up dying in shallow water because this is what happened. It is a bizarre concept to me that somehow the ocean isn't big enough for both white and black people to be in it. I mean, if you think about these white folks here who were so enraged at the idea of swimming in ocean water that a black person might be swimming in, did they consider that this is actually the same water that every black person in Africa is swimming in? They have beaches in Africa, and so the water is all fungible, it's all the same, but somehow the fact that they would be swimming in this water here in St. Augustine was too much for them. And so the attempt was to start drowning these the black swimmers. And I'm going to let you tune in on Monday to hear how Dr. Vivian ended up not getting drowned. But then what is sort of his most enduring legacy is after that Civil Rights Act of '64 got passed, in the late fall of '64, Dr. King decides the next struggle is going to be voting rights. For reasons I won't get into, they decide to do it in Selma. Selma, Alabama is going to be the focus of the voting rights struggle. And the field general in charge is Dr. Vivian. And one of the reasons they picked Selma was because they needed a villain. They needed a bad guy. They saw how effective having Bull Connor as a bad guy in Birmingham was. And they had a ready-made idiot to be their bad guy. And it's this guy who was the George Patton wannabe, Jim Clark. You'll see him with his white helmet there. And Dr. Vivian kind of played him, and John Lewis too. They both played him like a fiddle. And in one of the confrontations that's on national television, Dr. Vivian starts talking to Jim Clark's deputies behind him, explaining to them that just like the soldiers followed Hitler, that's what you're doing. You're following this guy, Jim Clark. And he says, he's not quite as bad as Hitler, but we know who you are, and you're going to have to live with what you've done. And Clark just kind of like tries to disengage, but it's sort of like, he had to be Jim Clark. He couldn't not engage. And so after a few seconds, he turns around and throws a left hook and takes Dr. Vivian to the ground. Just kind of, because why not? I'm the white sheriff and I can do that. In fact, he breaks his hand doing it. And Dr. Vivian gets up and nonviolently just confronts Clark all over again. And of course, he gets arrested many, many times. But the Selma campaign is triumphant. It does lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which more than anything else has changed America for the better. And that's when Dr. Vivian fades from the public view. But that's not when he fades from life. He leaves the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, sort of, if you will, sort of the direct action group, and he goes out and he becomes in charge of creating affiliate organizations throughout the country. But what does he do? How does he stay engaged in the world? Well, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Upward Bound, the college program for high school students. Dr. Vivian is kind of the grandfather of that, because he stayed in Alabama and he created a program down in Alabama in 1966 to get a bunch of black kids into college for the first time in their families. And that model he created became the Upward Bound program. The other thing he does is he starts working with labor unions and businesses, and he creates a coalition for United Community Action. He goes up to Chicago, and he creates this program that gets 20,000 black folks union jobs in manufacturing. And I don't know if any of you, before you retired and came here, had diversity training at any job you might have worked at. We have a wonderful diversity committee. This will be a totally unasked for plug for the diversity committee here at Mary's Woods, which is a wonderful group of people that I love interacting with. Dr. Vivian started a diversity consulting program over 40 years ago. He might very well have been the first person doing that. He did it for about 20 years, and then his son, who was a captain, it's ironic given that Dr. Vivian was so committed to nonviolence, but his son, who was a captain in the Army, basically heeded his father's call, Al Vivian, and Al then took it over. But the Vivians have been in the diversity training business for over 40 years, and Al Vivian is still doing it. Oh, okay, so this, what I want to do now, of course, and then sadly, Dr. Vivian passed away in July of last year. I had been at his 95th birthday party the summer before. I'd flown back to Atlanta for it. Obviously, I could not go to his funeral. It was limited to about 50 people. But they had a lot of video tributes, and I thought the best way to close out the penultimate thing we're going to do is show a video tribute to Dr. Vivian at his funeral. You may recognize the speaker. Nope, this isn't it. Here we go.
His remarks will speak for themselves.
I'm so honored to be a part of this celebration of Reverend Vivian's long life of purpose and meaning. To the family, from his children to his great-great-great-grandchildren, thank you sincerely for allowing me to join you today. I was an admirer. It is not easy to grieve in public and know from experience. It's not easy to lose a loved one who means so much to so many, but who meant the most to all of you. And CT was truly a remarkable man. A man whose physical courage was exceeded only by his moral courage, whose capacity for love overwhelmed incredible hatreds, whose faith in the power of nonviolence helped forever change our nation. The number of times he faced down being drowned, being beaten, being reviled, only to stand up straight as a ramrod, bloodied but unbent, and declare the truth that he saw so clearly. Quote, "You cannot turn your back on the idea of justice," end of quote. You know, it's hard for most people to wrap their heads around this, just what a man he was. But in Illinois, and in Tennessee, and Florida, and Mississippi, in the North and in the South, CT was there fighting to turn us back toward justice. A soldier who refused to raise his fist, a preacher whose voice helped electrify a movement, a leader who inspired generations to join him in the ceaseless march of progress. CT didn't waste a single one of the days God granted him. But we all know that CT's spirit is going to continue to inspire us to fulfill his mission, a mission that remains unfinished. Our fight for racial justice, to state the obvious, is incomplete. And CT's memory now commissions all of us into service to finish the work of perfecting our union, to make sure every person can freely exercise their sacred right to vote, to bring us that much closer to our ideals of equity and justice for all. CT has earned his rest, joining in eternity his beloved wife Octavia and his eldest son Cordy. And for as deep as we are in mourning of his loss, I can't help but think there must be a great celebration in heaven today. A reunion of good and faithful servants, entering together into the joy of the Lord. Many of us continue to feel here on earth the hopefulness, the purpose that infused CT throughout his life. May God be with you all during these difficult days.
When you watch Dr. Vivian's talk on Monday. What folks there didn't realize at the time, but I'm going to tell you, is that was his 5th talk in 3 days. The man was 91. He'd given a talk Thursday night at Seattle University Law School. He did a talk at lunch on Friday for the King County Bar Association. He and I and his dear friend Don Rivers and a friend of mine barnstormed down here from Seattle in time to make the 6 o'clock Friday night service at Temple Beth Israel. And then I rousted him up in the morning. We drove out to Vancouver, and he spoke at the Clark County Martin Luther King Day celebration. And then we came here. But what was interesting to me was, of all those 5 talks, the most alive, the most engaged I saw him was after he'd given his 4th talk at Clark County. Because that talk was organized by a remarkable woman here in our community named Dina Perot, who runs the Urban I-Teen program, where she works with young, primarily children of color, getting them involved in the tech world. And she had asked, do you think Dr. Vivian would be willing to talk to the kids before you drive over to Mary's Woods? So I asked him. And he said, oh, absolutely. He just lit up when I gave him the idea. And so after his 4th talk in 3 days, we just gathered all the kids around. There were about 20 of them in a circle on some tables. And he just held court with them for about a half an hour. And it was remarkable. He loved kids. He loved inspiring them, and he did. And then we came here. So really this is his 5th and a half talk in 3 days at 91. I'm going to give the last words about Dr. Vivian to Dr. Vivian. And this is from his memorial program that his daughter sent me. But this is from back in 2013 when he was talking after he'd received the Medal of Freedom. And I want you to think about, that was 2013, but couldn't this have been written, say January 5th? This is what he was talking about in terms of the movement. He said, did we win? Did we change the law? Did we open institutions? Did we help somebody? He said, there wasn't an institution in America that wasn't changed by what we did. But the victory isn't completely won yet. We still have to save America. Black people have to save America. It can't save itself. 400 years of slavery has proven that. He said that in 2013. So now I want to move on, because graciously I have some more time. Because as I thought about this, as I said at the beginning, when I thought about this notion of the rest of Dr. Vivian's life, I started thinking of it in the context of some of the veterans of the civil rights movement that I've just been so lucky to get to know. And so that's going to be our the focus we're going to talk about probably for about the next maybe 25 minutes or so. And I love this photograph. It's a photograph from Freedom Summer, and you'll see in the middle there's on your far left is a guy named Larry Gayotte, Lawrence Gayotte. Then next to him is Bob Moses, and next to Bob is Dave Dennis. And this is our lead-in. So after and some can say the golden age of the civil rights movement is from 55 to 65, some say 66, some say 1968 with the death of Dr. King. But where did these movement foot soldiers go? Foot soldiers and leaders. And they chose different paths. Some of them became politicians. ran for office. You see John Lewis, he became a congressman for over 20 years in Georgia. Elizabeth Holmes Norton, you're going to see a photograph later of her as a young woman, but she became the representative for the District of Columbia, in the delegate in Congress for over 30 years. She's still in that role. Marion Barry is next to her. Marion Barry, who was without a doubt one of the most interesting mayors we've had in a major American city. Definitely had his legal problems, but he was legendary within the movement. He was from Mississippi, and he was fearless in the movement within SNCC. There you see Andrew Young, who goes on to become a congressman from Atlanta, and then mayor of Atlanta, as well as United States ambassador. And Jesse Jackson, and I put Jesse Jackson with the politicians. He's also a community activist, but he did make a legitimate run for the presidency. So I think that allows him to be in that category. But I want to focus on these three folks: Bob Moses, Dave Dennis, and Heather Booth. I've already introduced you to Dave and Bob, and then you'll learn about Heather Booth. She's the white woman there with the guitar next to Fannie Lou Hamer. We'll start with Bob Moses. Bob Moses really was almost a mythical figure during the freedom movement in Mississippi. He comes down there in 1961 with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and really begins the whole process of trying to do voter registration. And one interesting thing, because you're going to hear about how it plays into the story. The Department of Justice was a very reluctant co-warrior in the Freedom Riders struggle. But what the department said to the young folks from SNCC and others is, look, it's all about the vote. You've got to get people registered to vote. There's something called the Voter Education Project, and we will help you. That's where we want you to spend your energy. And so that's part of what Bob Moses is doing down there. And it's a slow, person by person process. And what you need to understand when you think about this voter process, getting somebody registered to vote, if you're black in Mississippi and you register to vote, or you try to register to vote, you're doing that knowing there are consequences. Among the consequences of trying to register to vote, because more likely than not you won't actually register, but the process of trying to vote, this is the range of things that could happen to you, and undoubtedly at least one of them will. You'll lose your job, you'll lose your car, you'll lose your house, you'll lose your life. Any one of those scenarios could happen to you. Many times it did happen to you. And so the process of a young person going to you and saying, well, let's go register to vote. Think about if you're the one, if you're going to try to convince somebody to do something that could kill them, think about that as how are you going to judge victory? The fact that they didn't throw you out of the house is probably victory enough. But that is what Bob Moses and the SNCC folks are starting to do in 1961 and 62. Well, by 1964, they really were all in. And they had started an alternative party in Mississippi called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party was a whites-only affair. Even though it wasn't on paper anywhere, that was the reality. It was a whites-only affair. And so there was this process in 1964 where the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, provided the ground troops to try to get people to join this new party, an integrated party. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP provided a lot of the money for it and the legal support. But Bob Moses is the person in charge of that from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they actually create a whole series of delegates. This is the convention they held in Mississippi, in Jackson, in the summer of 1964, to choose the delegates that are going to go to Atlantic City to the Democratic Convention, where Lyndon Johnson is going to be nominated for president. And they are going to say to the Democratic Party, seat us as the delegates from Mississippi. Because, by the way, in case you hadn't looked at the papers, the Democratic Party of Mississippi, those delegates, they've already said they're going to vote for Goldwater. So you don't want them, you want us. And these two women, Fannie Lou Hamer and Alva Baker, are really the moral conscience of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and they're going to be leaders of it when they get to Atlantic City. And Atlantic City, with Bob Moses there, with Fannie Lou Hamer in the convention hall, what they get is pain. Because what happens is they get betrayed. Hubert Humphrey, who is one of the icons of the civil rights movement within the world of politicians, wants to be the vice president. Lyndon Johnson, remarkably enough, considering how well he won, is paranoid that if he seats the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and throws out the white Democrats, the whole South will go for Goldwater, and he's going to lose the election. And so he says to Hubert Humphrey, go make a deal with those people because they can't be the delegates. And Hubert Humphrey meets with the Mississippi Freedom Party delegation and tries to sell them on the idea, well, we'll let you have 2 delegates at large in the convention. You'll be our honored guests. And we're going to seat the white delegation, but they'll only be able to take their seats if they agree to support Johnson. And Fannie Lou Hamer famously says to Hubert Humphrey, I feel sorry for you. You're a good man, but you're doing a bad thing, and I feel sorry for you. I'm going to pray for you. But we didn't come here for no 2 seats. And so it was just the strangest thing in the world. All the whites left. They wouldn't let the black delegation in the seats. And you see on the boardwalk here a demonstration against how they were being treated. And what's in this remarkable photograph in the lower left-hand corner, you see Fannie Lou Hamer, but over her left shoulder is Eleanor Holmes Norton as a young woman who later became the delegate for DC for the next almost 40 years. And at the very far back of that picture is young Stokely Carmichael, who later takes over the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from John Lewis and becomes famous for his cry for Black Power 2 years later in 1966. Bob Moses was devastated by what happened in Atlantic City. They all felt betrayed. Bob Moses had put his heart and his soul and his life and physical health into bringing these men and women that he had nurtured to Atlantic City, thinking they were going to be seated as the delegates, that democracy was going to work. And it did not. It did not work in Atlantic City. And after all of the attacks and all the beatings that he responded to and just kept coming right back, this is what broke him. And he was now worried about getting drafted. It's 1964, even though he's old by SNCC standards. I think he hadn't quite turned 30 yet. He might have just barely turned 30. But he was certainly draft age. Johnson is upping the draft numbers for Vietnam. And so Bob Moses drops the Moses from his name, takes his middle name. Paris is his last name. And he and his wife go to Africa. They go to Tanzania to stay away from the draft. They have some children, and eventually they make their way back to America. And they're living in Boston. Well, the thing about Bob Moses was, and I didn't say this at the beginning, when he went down to Mississippi in 1961, he was a math teacher in New York. That's what he was doing when he saw the Freedom Riders, excuse me, and he felt he had to get in the game. So he gave up his job as a math teacher. I have to tell you, it is hard for me to relate to a math teacher. My brother, the civil engineer, thinks like pocket calculators were invented just so I could get 2 + 2 to equal the right answer. And as lawyers, we just hire economists. So I can't relate to math teachers, but he was apparently a brilliant math teacher. And he starts helping out at his daughter's school. And what he starts realizing fairly soon is black kids are not getting taught math. And if you're not getting taught what I call the hard stuff, because actually, in reality, I can add, I can multiply, and I can divide. Don't ask me the square root of anything, but I can do that stuff. But algebra, calculus, trigonometry, you must be kidding. But I survived 2 years of algebra in high school, and in fact, if you want to go to college, most colleges say you have to have taken algebra in high school. And black kids weren't getting algebra. And so Bob started a program in the Northeast called the Algebra Project called the Algebra Project to get kids of color, many times lower income kids of color, to be proficient in algebra. And he had really unique ways of teaching it. And his goal, he said, our goal was to help schools and communities increase their capacity to ensure a quality education for every child. And so that's what he's doing now. What I say now, I'm talking about the late 80s. He becomes fully committed, as the way he was committed to the voting project. He's committed to this notion of helping tens of thousands of kids get decent education in math. We're going to pick up that story again in a few minutes. Back to Dave Dennis. Because Dave was Bob's counterpart with CORE. Dave's a freedom rider, and I love this photograph. This is in Life magazine. It's actually considered Life magazine considers this one of its 75 most important pictures of the 20th century. And I asked Dave, because Dave came out and spoke at Beth Israel, and he and I become, our families are now very close friends. He visits me, I visit him. And I asked him about this photograph, and he said, yeah, he was looking at that guy, and he just was kind of like, just trying to convince himself what side that guy was on. And he said not too long after this photograph was taken, they hit a bump, and the kid stuck his bayonet up into the roof of the car, or of the bus. Dave was the first one to admit that he got into the movement because when he was at Southern University, there was this absolutely gorgeous young woman that he wanted to go out with on a date. And she said to him, well, if you're interested in coming, you got to come to this meeting with me. And then she said, well, if you want to go on a date with me, you have to go to the sit-in with me. And as Dave said, he actually ultimately never had a date with this young woman. But she got him into the movement. And he became part of CORE. And if you remember the Freedom Rider story, CORE starts the Freedom Rides. All their people get beaten to a pulp. They've got to get them healed. During that healing process, the young students from Nashville take over the rides. And then after they get beaten to a pulp in Montgomery, the two groups combine. The CORE gets back into the game, and the first group of CORE folks to come up from New Orleans carrying the rides include Dave Dennis. One of the other things you don't know is that Dave was sure he was going to die on that ride. They did not know the deal that had been made. And Dave went on that first bus from Montgomery to Jackson thinking he was going to die on it, but he still thought it was worth doing. I want you to notice how Dave is dressed, though. The Freedom Riders, one of the things was they dressed nice. He's got a nice shirt on. But Dave stayed in the movement, and he stays in Mississippi, and he becomes Bob Moses' counterpart. Bob is running SNCC in Mississippi. Dave Dennis starts running CORE. So Dave had to adopt the uniform. This was the overalls, the nice shirts are gone. And now Dave is in charge of running the program in Mississippi. And so in the summer of 1964, when they're not only running the education program, but they launch Freedom Summer, which is when they convince 1,000, probably 800 to 1,000 college kids, more white than black, to come into Mississippi from the north to register voters, to start the freedom schools, and to bring attention of the world to Mississippi. Because what happens is you've got the children of congressmen, the children of FBI agents, the children of governors coming into the state of Mississippi. And the idea is, if something, first of all, they'll report back on what their experiences are, and if something god-awful happens to them, the world will actually pay attention. And in terms of something god-awful happening, that's this poster. Andrew Goodman, who'd been in Mississippi for 24 hours, James Chaney and Mickey Schwerner, who were actually CORE workers in Meridian, Mississippi. James was from Meridian. Mickey had been down in Meridian for about 6 months. In June of 1964, they are kidnapped and murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Well, this has a devastating impact on Dave for a couple of reasons. One of them is he was meant to be with them. What had happened was a church just outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, had been burned to the ground after the whites in the area had come to believe that church was going to be involved, either hosting a freedom school or hosting civil rights meetings from the civil rights workers, because Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney had been talking with the folks up there. And so the Klan, the belief was the Klan came and they burned that church down to the ground in revenge. And so all of the students who were coming into Mississippi were being trained in Ohio. Mickey and James had gone to be part of the training crew, and Andrew was one of those students from Queens College in New York who'd agreed to work out of Meridian. And they drove into Meridian from Ohio, from where they were training, and then they went up to Neshoba County. And Dave was supposed to go with them once they got to Meridian, but he had come down with a case of bronchitis. And so he went back to Louisiana for his mom to nurse him back to health. And so they headed north, and he went west, and they were killed. And so Dave had to deal with this sense of, one, I should have been with them when they were killed, and two, if I had been with them, I could have come up with something to keep them from getting killed. And myself, and pretty much anybody else who talks to Dave about that, says, no, you would have just gotten killed. But it had a huge impact on him. And Dave was asked, because James Chaney was a CORE person, Dave was asked to give the eulogy at James's death, at James's funeral. And it becomes one of the most iconic moments of Freedom Summer. And we're going to watch a video of part of it. But before you watch it, what I want to say to you is, and go ahead and set it up, Stacey. But as you watch it, you're going to hear a guy named Bruce Watson, and he's the author of this book, Freedom Summer. You're going to hear Bruce Watson describe Dave's eulogy and listen and see if you hear out of Dave's mouth what Bruce is describing. And we'll talk about that after this. It's only a couple minutes.
In Mississippi, a memorial service was held for James Chaney.
The decision had been made by family members and local leaders and others that they wanted to keep this very quiet and then low key, rather, did their eulogy.
I want to talk about is really what I really grieve about. I don't grieve for Chaney because of the fact I feel that he lived a fuller life than many of us will ever live. I feel that he's gotten his freedom and we're still fighting for it.
Dave Dennis's speech was a turning point in the summer because everybody wanted him to say the usual things that you would say at a funeral. And Dave Dennis just couldn't do it. He challenged the people at the memorial, and he challenged the whole movement.
You see, we all tired. You see, I know what's going to happen. I feel it deep in my heart when they find the people who killed those guys in Neshoba County.
All the different emotions, things they've been going through, leading up to this particular moment, began to come out, boil up, and we might call this. And then looking out there and seeing Ben Chaney, James Chaney's little brother. I lost it. I totally just lost it.
Don't bow down anymore. Hold your heads up. You want our freedom now. I don't want to have to go to another memorial. Tired of funeral. Tired of it. Got to stand up.
Okay. So, you heard Bruce Watson describe it, but you don't really get that. And one of the questions, that in the Black Lives Matter movement now, and the way we're looking at history now is sort of how much can we take? How much can we actually accept? And I feel like in that documentary, we were all shortchanged. We were all sold short that we couldn't take it. This is Watson's book, and I'm going to read you more of what Dave said that day to give you an idea of why it was so revolutionary. He said, "Sorry, but I'm not here to do the traditional thing most of us do at such a gathering. What I want to talk about right now is the living dead that we have right amongst our midst, not only in the state of Mississippi, but throughout the nation. Those are the people who don't care." He says, "I've got bitter vengeance in my heart tonight, and I'm not going to stand here and ask anybody here not to be angry tonight." He says, those guys that killed the people, when they find the people who killed those guys in Neshoba County, there'll be a trial and a jury of their cousins, their aunts, and their uncles. They're going to say not guilty because no one saw him pull the trigger. I'm tired of that. He said, "Don't get your frustration out by clapping your hands. This is our country. We didn't ask to come here when they brought us over here. The best thing that we can do for Mr. Chaney, for Mickey Schwerner, for Andrew Goodman, is to stand up and demand our rights. Don't just look at me and the people here and go back and say that you've been to a nice service. If you do go back home and sit down and take it, God damn your souls. We want our freedom now. I don't want to go to another memorial. I'm tired of funerals. Tired of it. We've got to stand up." That's what he said. And the question is, can we hear that? And Dave is the first one to talk about the fact he was suffering from PTSD from that summer, and he just had to walk away from it. And he did. He went up to the University of Michigan for law school, and he started a whole new life. Practiced law for about 20 years in the South, in Louisiana, where he was from. And then at the 25-year reunion of Freedom Summer, he bumped into Bob Moses. And he and Bob had been tight in '64. The fact that you had these two organizations, CORE and SNCC, getting along so well with each other was because how tight Bob and Dave were. But they really had been out of touch. Remember, Bob Moses was over in Tanzania, eventually comes back, and he tells Dave about the Algebra Project. Well, Dave doesn't want to move up to Boston. Dave's at that point living in South Carolina. But thank God, Dave was not as intimidated by the idea of algebra as I am. And he said, sure, I'll be part of it. And so that's when the Southern Initiative Algebra Project was born. And there you see Dave down at the bottom. And Dave's in his mid-80s now, early 80s. And he's running not with COVID, but up until then, he was running all over the South, out to, he had a project in Petersburg, in Jackson, in Louisiana, even over in Arizona, constantly on airplanes, flying around, getting kids quality education. And I want to point out a couple of what I'm going to call the next generation. These are people that have been mentored by Dave and Bob Moses. Albert Sykes is this wonderful young man in Jackson that I've gotten to know. Here he is standing in front of Medgar Evers' home in Jackson. And Albert is keeping the Algebra Project alive in Mississippi. And I don't know how well you see it on your screen, but that's a young scholar, John Hale. He's a professor at the University of South Carolina who has really been taken in as one of Dave's children. Who's written a wonderful book on the Freedom Schools during Freedom Summer, and this is just this new generation that they are mentoring. So now I want to shift over, talk about Heather Booth. I call her the white woman with the guitar. This is a very famous photograph from Freedom Summer. That's Fannie Lou Hamer, and there's just this sort of young woman who's got a guitar standing next to her, because Fannie Lou Hamer would sing and sing and sing, powerful voice. I always knew this photograph. And I went down to Jackson in 2014 for the 50th anniversary, and there was a whole series of programs that all throughout about a 4-day period, and the Institute for Southern Jewish Life, which is located in Jackson, ran about 3 or 4 Jewish-centric programs from Freedom Summer. And I was talking to this amazingly dynamic woman named Heather Booth, and I think it was around the 4th day when somebody said to me, she's the white girl from the photograph with Fannie Lou Hamer. And I said, you're kidding me. So it was like, oh my gosh, there she is. But she was about 19 at the time. I think she had just finished her freshman year at the University of Chicago. She was from the Long Island, but she goes back up to Chicago. And, this is during Freedom Summer. One of the things she did was she walked picket lines, trying to help people register to vote. But she goes back up to the University of Chicago, and she, is of that, think about it, 1965, 66, when feminism is really, and I will apologize, I don't know the wave numbers. I'm not sure what wave we were in at the time, but that's when she starts riding the wave and gets very involved in feminism issues that are relevant. And she gets married and starts having kids, and one of the first things she starts fighting for is she starts fighting the city of Chicago to looking at the need for child daycare. And just think about now with COVID, what happened when, how many women have left the workforce because their children, their husbands could go back into a work setting, but there was no child care, there was no school, and we lost hundreds of thousands of women to the workforce because of child care issues. It's just now in the last 6 months, and Heather was doing that fight in Chicago in the 1960s. And she finds that she's become an organizer, almost just by default. She is starting to organize groups and movements. And she decides, what the heck? Organizing can be taught. And she starts the Midwest Academy to teach young people how to become community organizers. And she breaks it down, and she just sets off a whole generation of folks throughout the whole United States that are now community organizers. She got involved in labor organizing, and there's a great story about Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, when she's a senator, really wants to create this consumer protection bureau. She's tired of people getting ripped off, and she wants to take on the banks and take on all these other businesses and create a consumer financial protection bureau. And everybody's saying to her, that you're going to have to get organized to do that, to fight the big banks and to fight these large companies or whatever. She says, okay, how do I get organized? And this is her quote. Somebody says to her, I have 2 words for you, Heather Booth. And so Elizabeth Warren reaches out to Heather Booth, who since then moved to Washington, D.C., and Booth runs the public grassroots campaign to convince legislators that they should be supporting this new organization. And in fact, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was born. And one of their most stunning victories, fairly soon after they went into creation, was they got $3 billion back from Wells Fargo for corrupt business practices. And there was a dedicated group of young folks doing their legal work that I actually had the joy of training for a couple years in a row. And then, of course, President Trump got elected, and a guy named Mick Mulvaney was put in charge of it with these sort of express mission of neutering it, which he fairly successfully has done, but hopefully there's enough beating still going on in the heart of the CFPB that in the next administration it will start protecting us again. But this is sort of the last quote I'll leave you with, and this is Heather Booth talking about what it's like to be an organizer, because she's 75 and she's still doing it now. To be an organizer, you have to love people and hate injustice. And that's just a wonderful way to wrap up the mindset of this generation that came out of the civil rights movement. And so with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all next Monday at 2 o'clock. Right, Stacy?
That's right.
Right. Okay. Thanks, everybody.